I should let him. Okay. Yeah. Good evening, everybody. Very warm welcome to the book launch, Indian book launch. I guess it is, Richard, right? The Indian book launch of the Globotics Upheaval, Globalisation, Robotics, and the Future of Work by Richard Baldwin, Professor of International Economics, the Graduate Institute, Geneva. I'm going to read out a bit of his CV, but what I suggest is you go to the net because there's too much. Otherwise, I'll spend as much time as Richard would spend on the talk. So I suggest just say a few things which I think stand out. He's a professor of international economics at the Graduate Institute in Geneva and editor-in-chief of the economic policy portal voxeu.org. Before coming to Geneva, he was senior staff for the President's Council of Economic Advisors in the Elder Bush administration. This, I think, is just prior to Clinton at 92, right? Yeah, the Elder Bush administration. This is 1991.
They call the real President Bush.
Following trade negotiations such as Uruguay Round, NAFTA, which has now been renamed, and numerous US-Japan trade disputes. He's been a visiting professor at Oxford, at MIT, and started his academic career as a professor at the Columbia School of Business in New York. And he's authored numerous books. His 2016 book, The Great Convergence, Information Technology and the New Globalization, was published by Harvard University Press in November 2016 and cited by Financial Times, otherwise known as FT, and The Economist as among the best books of 2016. He wrote his PhD at MIT under the guidance of Paul Krugman, and all of us know Paul Krugman, right, with whom he has co-authored half a dozen articles. His MSc in economics is from LSE, the London School of Economics, and his BA from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and he has honorary doctorates from the University, the Turku School of Economics and Business in Finland, the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland, and the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Peru. I don't know, I made a mess of that, but PUCP in Peru. So, and there's several other achievements to Richard's name, and we're really grateful that he's come to ICRIER, to Delhi, to launch the book. We were supposed to have a discussant in the program. You would see the Commerce Secretary who was going to be here. Unfortunately, you know the reasons why he cannot be here, so let me not go into that. Let me talk a little bit about the future of work and why it's sort of important for India. What we think in ICRIER is important for India, because there are so many alarmist views going around. And I remember Montague himself was speaking at the World Bank, and I remember that distinctly, Montague. This was, I think, 2016, just before Mr. Trump got elected. We had a conference in the World Bank, and Montague was a part of the plenary session. I remember Montague saying that alarmist views are actually detrimental for policymakers in emerging markets. And that was coming close on the heels of, sort of news item that emanated from the World Bank that India was going to lose 69% of jobs due to automation. And I think that was really alarmist. It rang the alarm bells, amongst academics and amongst policymakers. But it also does a lot of disservice in the sense to what you want to do or what policymakers want to do. Why it does a disservice? Because then you stand back and say, hey, this is too big a problem and I can do nothing about it. But fortunately, I think the work has moved on from 2016, and we recognize, especially in countries like India, that there might be job losses, there will also be job gains, but it's not entire jobs that will go. The economic literature is being refined. You're going down to the level of tasks, and when at the level of tasks, the same person doing the task, interacting with the machine, makes the job much more efficient, and you add efficiency and productivity gains, and then other jobs or other tasks would be created. So the 69% number, and there were similar numbers for other countries, emerging markets, and I think those were very high, and I think still they would prove to be really high numbers. So we need to be able to be cautious on how we create the evidence, and not entire jobs, focus on tasks, and Richard will talk about that. Plus, for countries like India, which have comparative advantage in labor-intensive industries, the possibility of replacement, given the wages, is not going to be that high. Although those of you who worked on India and development economics know that we are no strangers of substitution of labor by capital. But that had nothing to do with automation. That the roots of that existed in some other policies, and there was substitution of labor by capital in various industries, including in labor-intensive industries like textiles and toys and leather. But that was not due to automation, that was due to other reasons. So this is an important topic for emerging markets for India, extremely important, because if you look at the profile of India's population, and all of you know this, 65% of the people are below the age of 35, 50% are below the age of 25, 12 million are going to be added to the workforce every year. Therefore, we need to create 1 million jobs a month for the next, 5-6 years. So the task is daunting. And I think both protectionism and automation are challenges, but I don't think they are insurmountable challenges. But I will wait to hear from Richard on what he thinks about this new phenomena. And let me share this with you, having heard Richard yesterday. Let me share this with you, what I think will happen. You won't even know that an hour has passed, or an hour and a half has passed. You won't even know that you've learned so much, because it will be so easy to sort of grasp what he's saying. And soon you'll be looking at your clocks, geez, it's already 9 p.m. and we better close. So this is going to be a treat. I think this is a mouth-watering treat that we are going to get from Richard. So before I give him the floor, I also want to thank ADBI, the Asian Development Bank Institute, that you will see up, the logo of which you will see up there, or you do see up here, who supported us in bringing Richard to Delhi and to ICRIER. So thank you all very much for coming, and I see a number of distinguished people in the audience, and thank you, Richard, for agreeing to come and speaking here. You can take as long as you like. Okay. Thank you.
In the audience. And I also want to thank Rajat in particular for making it possible. Also, Anirudh Shengal, should I put that on? Okay. Anirudh Shengal, who I knew from Switzerland, actually facilitated this directly. So I want to thank all of you. These things are hard to do, hard to fund, hard to arrange, and I really do appreciate it, so that I can get my book out further than it was. But I'd also like to apologize that this book isn't really about India, and in fact it wasn't written with an emerging market audience in mind. But I hope that you find the points interesting and insightful and provocative. I wrote this book to provoke people to think harder about the future of work. You see, I think the future of work is going to be very different than the world of work we know now. And I think people are all around the world not thinking hard enough about it. They're denying the change is happening, and the people who know about it are often hoping it won't come as fast as it could. As Rajat said, there's numbers out there that are mind-blowing, And a lot of people reacted to that by saying, well, we can't do anything. But many, many policymakers, business people, and journalists are just simply unaware of how fast the changes are coming. And I hope at the end of this 50 minutes or so, I will have raised your anxiety a little bit about the future, but also your excitement about the future. The changes will cause winners and losers. And that is something we have to deal with, I believe. Now that said, my whole talk will be about the future. What's going to happen? Therefore, nothing I can say can be proven, but also it can't be disproven. The good part. But my point is to make you think harder, to try and marshal a bit of logic and a bit of facts to make you think hard about the future. And above all, I'd like to make you realize that the future of work is not going to be like it is right now. What's truly uncertain is whether the changes will come in 2 years, or 3 years, or 5 years, or if we're lucky, 20 years, or if we're lucky in the north, 20 years. Here in the south, you'd probably be better off with 5 years. But in any case, we don't actually know how fast this is coming, and it's not a lack of knowledge, it's unknowable. We're talking about future trends that have all sorts of snowball effects, threshold effects, feedback, multiple equilibrium, things that we just don't know how fast they will happen, but probably once they start happening, they will happen very quickly. So that's what I'd like to sort of leave with the India audience in particular, not anything particular to say about India, but to say something about the future and the trends that are shaping it. And hopefully in Q and A, if it's anything like last night, we'll have lots and lots of questions and discussions about what's going forward. And I don't know anything more about India's future than I know anything about the real future, but let's talk about it. So let me get through a few slides first to lay out some thinking. So let me start with some definitions. So let's start with globotics. Globotics is smashing together globalization and robotics. You probably figured that out. But actually, I've given this to a lot of English language, non-English language audiences, and I have to explain the whole thing about globotics. So I developed this little infographic of what I mean. In my mind, the big driving force of the future is digital technology. Digital technology, the ability to gather, store, process, and transmit information, is accelerating at an insane pace, explosive pace, almost hard to understand. And I'll try a little bit tonight to stimulate that thinking. But that digital technology is not just affecting automation, which is what you read about every day. Machines that, can open doors or drive cars or things like that. That's what you read about every day. They're also affecting globalization. Because deep down, wherever information matters, digital technology is changing that world. The interesting kind of thing, and it goes all over every aspect, is some things are physical and controlled by the old processes. Some things involve information and are controlled by the new processes. And I think we are, as a society, a series of societies, a world, figuring out what is what by different types of areas. And it's disrupting different types of areas differently. So let me start with the globalization part, telemigration, which is another word I invented to try and sell books. No, I mean to try and stimulate people's thinking. So telemigration is people sitting in one nation working in offices in another. Basically, it's a way of doing freelancing or the gig economy, but internationally. So in some ways, there's absolutely nothing new about it. And in fact, it's going on in a very important way already, especially in certain industries. So for instance, in web development or IT, the idea that you have an international team of people working on a project at the same time using collaborative software, that's completely mainstream. It's done all the time. And in things like finance, very frequently there's international teams that are working. And all I'm saying is that's just going to spread to a much wider range of jobs. Now, what I want to talk about in telemigrations is, instead of defining it or trying to show some statistics. And by the way, if you want statistics, there's an institute in Oxford called the iLabor Institute, which is gathering statistics on this telemigration, international freelancing, and has a lot of data, and you can look at it. Well, what I want to do is tell a story. Emma Nato, copy editor that I hired on Upwork. So for my website, we added a new feature, blogs, and we needed more copy editing capacity. And what we've been using so far is either PhD students who had previous writing experience or journalists in London who had lost their job, basically, and were writing for us. And they charge about £25 an hour, which is kind of expensive for a nonprofit like us. And so I went on Upwork to find Emma N. Actually, I shouldn't have put the last name up there. Anyway, forget about the last name. Don't take pictures of that. So you can see Emma N, Bangkok, Thailand. This is one of the ones I came up with. There was a machine matching that matched people with my, I put up a job posting, and they sent me about 5 people, and I looked through them, and I decided to interview 3 of them by Skype, and I interviewed 3 of them by Skype, and I did 2 of them I had do a little test, and she won this sort of thing. Now, interestingly, she is a Japanese national, raised in the United States, absolutely fluent. She did a master's degree in international affairs at Columbia University. I think she's married to somebody who's working in the UN in Bangkok. She used to be a project manager for the UN, but now she's working on Upwork. And she wanted, is the price there? Now she's up to 35 hours an hour. But when I hired her, she was $15 an hour, which we raised her salary. But think about that. How would I have ever found this woman? She's a really good copy editor, by the way, and turns things around really quick. And how would I have ever found her before the rise of things like Upwork, which are matchmaking platforms in the internet, and one very important way in which this world is different than the other world. One of the things that separated the service market globally was the fact that you couldn't find people. Now, maybe you could if you were Amex, American Express, and you set up an entire office in Buenos Aires and hired people out of the universities. But me hiring one copy editor, sitting in Geneva for a website in London, you would never have found them. But now you can quite easily. So you can hire, fire, manage, pay this person there. So for example, I put up a credit card, the CPR's credit card, and she bills the hours, and the credit card is debited immediately for her hours. And that's one of the problems in this freelancing area is people don't get paid. They do the work and then they don't actually get paid. So Upwork skips over that sort of thing. And how do I know she's not cheating on the hours? Well, the Upwork software takes screenshots of her computer while she says she's working for me. So I can actually check if she's spending all those hours. In actual fact, I know how many hours it takes to edit things, so I don't do that, but I could do that if I wanted to. So this is a woman who's in a relatively high-end white-collar profession, competing directly with London journalists in London and asking originally way less than they would. So that is a changing world. There's another type of change. This was the telemigration thing, and I don't have to tell people in India that that's going all over sorts of services. Another end is the white-collar robots, or artificial intelligence. And when I call them white-collar robots, it's not machines, robots, with little treads that are wearing white collars. It's robots who do white-collar jobs. And in fact, they're software. They're not robots at all, in some sense. But people call them robots, and the industry calls them robots, because they do jobs in a human-like way. And in some sense, they're acting like a humans. And the first one here, the low end, is called robotic process automation, or virtual assistants. Let's talk about robotic process automation. These are essentially software that do repetitive service tasks in an automated way. And they're actually trained by humans to do repetitive tasks. And one of the interesting things I found when I was researching this is the people who train these things usually give them names, like Emily or There was another one was Fred. There was a virtual assistant. I can't remember. It was a woman's name in Texas. But in any case, I think it's interesting that the people training these to do their job, and it is essentially replacing them eventually, or at least augmenting them, they don't give them names like their Excel spreadsheets. They give them human names. And there's even examples where they invite them to parties and they treat them almost like humans, because in some sense, they are doing the human's job, but they're a little frail. They can't do the most difficult things. And I think that's an important hint that this is a type of technology which is very different than the technology we've seen in the last few years, because it's so human, people actually humanize it. At the high end, there's all sorts of AI platforms. So IBM has Watson, there's robo-lawyers, there's any number of platforms. Many of the Indian big outsourcing services have their own AI platforms. And these things are also automating, but often at a higher level job. They do things like read all the documents in a criminal case, in an e-discovery, and create a database that finds patterns on their own, or it's like a Google for the lawyer. They can say, when did Mr. So-and-so talk to Mrs. So-and-so about this the first time? And it searches through 100,000 emails and 10,000 documents and says, Tuesday, 19th, 1975, exactly like that. Instead, you used to have tons of junior lawyers reading these papers and summarizing them. So that's the automation part that's coming to the white-collar service. What I want to do with Globotics is say the same jobs, service sector jobs, are being affected by globalization. And by that I mean direct wage competition for people sitting in the north from people who are sitting in emerging markets. And those same jobs, not exactly the same jobs, but in the same sectors, are being automated as well, especially in the north where people are very expensive. That's what brings the second word in my title, upheaval. I'm very worried that this will lead to an upheaval in the north and a backlash against both the automation and the globalization, as it did in manufacturing, but that happened in slow motion. I think this could happen faster. Okay, so the high end of these AI-enabled systems, I told you about IBM Watson, that's in medicine. It's also in HR. In many companies, they're doing the initial HR screening by a software, not a human. Bank of America has Erica, which is helping customers and replacing client people. JP Morgan has Coin, which looks through their contracts and is replacing tens of thousands of hours of legal work. Heliograph is a Washington Post robo-reporter that wrote up the last presidential elections, is writing up elections. IBM Stored IQ, e-discovery, that's a lawyer thing. Xerox Litigation Service is a lawyer thing. So all sorts of things that you might have thought needed humans are actually being automated by software now. And that's replacing jobs in a subtle way. Okay, so what I want to do now is spend the next few minutes convincing you that this isn't just more of the same. I think you should think of this as a third great transformation of our modern economy. The first was when we moved from farms to factories. Remember, I'm talking about the north here. The second was when we moved from factories to offices. And this one will move from service jobs to sheltered service jobs. And what I mean by sheltered service jobs are jobs that can't be done by IBM Watson or RPA, and can't be done by telemigrants from India or Philippines or wherever. Those sheltered jobs are the ones that are going to be left. And that's the next transformation. So, as I said, the first big difference is it's affecting service and professional jobs actually all around the world, but I'm focusing on the US and Europe in particular. And not just factory jobs as has been going on. And this is a theme I want to come back again and again, and that I found systematic misthinking in a lot of the research, is that people are thinking that the next wave of globalization will be just like the last one. And one of the most important differences is it's not going to be happening in manufacturing. It's going to be happening in services. If you think about the last two transformations, you can see here I have data for the US economy employment shares. The green is agriculture, and it goes back to 1830. There's data that goes back further, but this is the reliable stuff. The gray is the factory jobs rising up, and the blue is the service jobs coming up. And so I would define this from, let's say, well, even goes back further. It's something like 1720 to 1970 was the first transformation where mechanical power moved people out of agriculture and into industry at the same time. The mechanical power eliminated jobs in the agricultural sector, while mechanization created jobs in the industrial sector. So the industry was both a push and a pull. And in particular, once the second industrial revolution got going from about 1870, it created a whole series of goods that we didn't know we needed, like fans or air conditioning or cars or airplanes or steam engines or diesel engines or electric power plants. Those are things that we didn't know we would need, and the industry, the technology, created those jobs. From about 1973, when the computer on a chip was invented, automation changed nature fundamentally. Because basically, once you put a computer on the chip onto a robot arm, it could replace a lot of manual work. Anything that was repetitive manual work could be programmed into the chip and put on the robot arm. And that undermined the value of people who work with their hands, that technology. At the same time, the computerization created a whole set of tools that made people who work with their heads more valuable. But to make those tools work, things like spreadsheets and databases and word processing programs, telephones, laptops, to make that stuff work, you needed a university degree. So the technology from 73 to, say, 2016 provided better substitutes for people who work with their hands, but better tools for people who work for their heads. And that was fundamentally inequalizing. It started creating service jobs. The ICT started creating service jobs, and we started paying for services that we didn't even know we needed. But it was fundamentally inequalizing at the time. I don't think the next one will be the same way. So, for instance, well, let me come to how I say it in a second. So the second really big difference is Digitech is ICT, but different. So the way I want to explain that is deep down, Digitech, or digital technology, which everybody's talking about now, is information and communication technology. It's old wine in new bottle. It's the same thing. It's basically Moore's law, Gilder's law, stuff like that, which means we can process information and communicate it much faster and much more reliably. But the big difference is, as far as automation and globalization was concerned, for the last 25 years, ICT was applied to manufacturing, which is mostly a physical process and involves a little bit of information and a little bit of communication. Not much. Now, that ICT completely revolutionized manufacturing. It was only a little thing, but it allowed companies to offshore production facilities in a way that transformed the world of manufacturing. For example, Bombardier makes the tails of some of their business jets in central Mexico. Now, just imagine, before ICT, trying to coordinate the production of the tails in Mexico to fit the rest of the plane in Quebec with fax, telephone, or airmail letters. Just imagine how that would have worked out. It would have been impossible, and nobody did it. ICT made it possible for G7 firms to unbundle their production process and move parts of it to nearby developing countries and control it and coordinate it. Now, that wasn't the revolutionary part. The revolutionary part was that they sent their know-how along with the factory jobs. People in central Mexico are not using Mexican technology to make Bombardier tails. They're using Canadian technology, which used to be only used by Canadian workers. So the big transformation, although it was a small amount, that information was critical to changing the nature of and manufacturing. This is what I call the second unbundling, and led to offshoring by G7 firms to nearby developing countries from about 1990 on, and it changed the world, above all in China. Digital tech is going to be applied to services, is being applied to services, and for services it's mostly information and mostly communication and only a little bit of physics, a little bit of physical. Now what that means is the old ICT and the new digital technology use different physics. So if you want to ask yourself, why should we expect the future to be different than the past? At least a large part of the answer is different physics. What do I mean by that? The physics of matter is a constraining factor on all economic activity. And normally we don't even think about it, it's just in the background. It's in how fast can things change in a physical world? How fast could you actually develop a manufacturing sector? How fast could you increase your manufacturing exports? In the background, the answer is not that fast. Because you have to build factories, and that takes time. You have to build ships, and that takes time. When it comes to services, we're talking about electrons crossing the internet and photons crossing fiber cables. And that can happen much, much faster. Moreover, the companies organizing it, both on the buying side and the selling side, don't have to build factories to create a lot of jobs or change the way things are done. All they have to do is shuffle around the chairs or go to an open office. To give that a concrete feeling, just think about how long it would take to double the flows of goods and services. The answer is decades. Think how long it takes to double the flows of information. The answer is a couple years. Has been for the last 10 years, will be for the next 10 years. And this different physics implies a completely different speed. So if you're thinking about the speed of the future using the speed of what we've seen, you're using the wrong physics. Now I want to nail that point down by telling a little personal story. I enrolled in university in 1976. Yeah, I know I look young, but I enrolled in 76. And I was first going to be a doctor, and then I was going to be a lawyer, and then I was going to be a journalist. And I did economics because I found it easy, and you know, I got A's. 4 years later, I graduated, and I worked a little while, and then I got a master's, and then I graduated, and I got a PhD, and I worked 8 years as a professor before the trade flows doubled. My daughter enrolled in university in 2015, and the trade flows have doubled twice in information since she went to college. She's not done with college. They'll probably double 3 times more, but she's a doctor, unfortunately, or fortunately, or she's going to be a doctor, hopefully. But in any case, the world will be entirely different by the time she graduates. Just think about the world where you have 2 decades to figure out what you want to do and deal with competition from globalization versus a world where in 2 years it could all be very different. That's, I think, a key point, the speed. The second is AI. Today's AI, artificial intelligence, is different. So this is like an adult literary class. I'm going to read aloud while you read along, okay? In 2019, computers can read, write, see, speak, understand speech, create visual output, recognize subtle patterns. In 2015, they couldn't. So what changed? Why is this time different? And my answer in searching through the literature while I was trying to research this book is that the programming is different. We're programming computers in a revolutionarily different way. Therefore, the computer capacities we have today are not like they were in 2015, but faster. This isn't just a bigger database or a computer which works longer on the battery or has faster processing of data. This is something completely different. In fact, I'd like to define it as a continental divide in cognition. I would say the first continental divide came in computerization, say or late 1960s, 1970s. Computers started to be able to do arithmetic and math, and they started to be able to organize things,
plot graphs. Many of you, well, some of you may remember when a spreadsheet was actually spreading out in a book, and somebody typed those numbers in by hand and then photocopied them. That was the old days. Now, the first continental divide was when computers could start to do certain kinds of cognitive capacities, and that wiped out a huge number of jobs. Nobody was typing anymore. Nobody was answering phones anymore, because computers could do those things. What I believe happened in 2016 is another continental divide. Computers started to think in an entirely different way. And that's what I want to explain with this slide. The famous book, Thinking Slow, Thinking Fast, by Daniel Kahneman, who's a psychologist. Anybody read this book or heard about this book? Okay, you should. If it's, I guess this is not a university. I can't get the students to raise their hands. You guys are all serious people. But how about not? That'll make me feel good, okay? There we go. All right, okay. And if you haven't read it, read it. It's just truly inspirational. But what he talks about is the two ways that humans have of thinking. Thinking slow is what we usually think about when we say thinking. So it's effortful, it's logical, it's slow, it's difficult, and above all, for my purposes, is you know how you do it. For example, when you do algebra to calculate, say, the trajectory of a bullet, you know how you do that. You learned in school how to do that. And as a consequence, a sufficiently clever computer programmer can turn that into a set of logical instructions that tells the computer what to do in every logical possible situation. So through coding, through programming, you could teach computers to think slow because we know how we think slow. Now there's a whole set of other cognitive capacities that humans have, which Kahneman calls thinking fast, which are unconscious, which are effortless. You often even can't stop yourself from doing them. And amazingly, you can often do 2 or 3 things at the same time without even knowing you're doing it. But the most important thing for the purposes of today is you don't know how you do it. You don't know how you recognize speech. You don't know how you start listening to somebody with a strange accent, and after a few minutes you start to understand them. You don't know how you did that. So you can't teach a computer to do that. What we have done increasingly, but 2016 was sort of a watershed year. It was a continuous process, but let's say 2016 because we need a date. Machine learning became very important. And I'd like you to think about machine learning as a new way of programming computers. So basically, hopefully there's nobody here who actually knows something about artificial intelligence, because I'm going to tell you about machine learning. And if there's somebody who actually knows what machine learning is, please sort of, maybe close your eyes and think of England for a while. I don't know. But in any case, at least be gentle with me if I make a mistake, okay? So the way machine learning works is you take a big structured data set, and by structured means things are clear. It means, for instance, I'm going to have 1 million photos, and some of them are going to have a cat in them. And I know whether this photo has a cat and this one doesn't have a cat. That's a structured database. Now you can take that 1 million data points, or say each photo is a data point, and estimate a statistical model to fit that. So in some sense, you're taking a whole bunch of inputs, hundreds of thousands of pixels are what you're putting in. And out you want it to guess cat, not cat. And what they do is estimate a whole bunch of statistical parameters using different kinds of techniques. They have fancy names and trees and neural networks and deep learning and hidden layers and all sorts of things like that. But basically it's a statistical model, just like the model they use to guess the weather. They put in a huge amount of data, they've trained it on past things, and it guesses what the weather's going to be. But at the end, it's a computer program. In the end, it's a set of instructions which are extremely complex on the computer. You put the input and out comes the output. So ultimately, you've written a computer program, but in an entirely different way. And the way you can tell it's entirely different is even the guys who estimated this model don't know how the computer recognizes a cat. They can't say, oh, it looked for the ears first, and then it found the eyes, and it calculated the position of the nose. It doesn't do that. It's just guessing like we guess. You put in a whole bunch of data, and you say, cat. That's it. How do you know? We don't know. But now these computers can do things like that when they never could before. Since 2016, computers have a set of thinking capacities that they never had before. And lots of those capacities are useful in the workplace, like reading. That's why the lawyers are being replaced. Before, computers couldn't really read a random document and make any sense of it. They could digitize it and store it, but they couldn't like read 100,000 emails and look for correlations using things like Leuven. Now they can. And those gateway skills, thinking, seeing, reading, have led to an automation of a whole set of human service sector jobs that could never have been automated before 2016. And it's showing up in your own life by, for instance, most common is you speak to your phone and it actually understands you. Siri speaks Hindi, right? And probably a bunch of other Indian languages. Does it? Yeah, okay. So, and I don't know if you're probably at least in English, a few years ago, so. You know, as long as you were very clear and you trained it, you could say, you know, open my emails and it would do that. But if you ask it, what's the temperature in Delhi, it wouldn't be able to do that. Anyways. So what I'd like to add too about how this is different, and this comes from the type of technology, is this is a technology which is not an extension of ITC. It's not an extension of what's been happening since the 70s. The way I want you to think about it is, who gains most from these new AI tools? Below average thinkers or above average thinkers? So just to make another confession, I'm a terrible speller. I was held back in the third grade, actually I came through, but I was put in the slow class because I was such a bad speller. And you know what? It doesn't matter now. So I was a below average speller, and this AI makes me a good speller. The good spellers, well, they're a little bit better good spellers. And what I would like to argue is that AI will soon be known as augmented intelligence, not artificial intelligence. And quite unlike the technologies of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, you do not need a university degree to use this. You need to be a rocket scientist to design it, but once they've designed it, it's dead easy to use. My wife's grandmother loves Siri because she doesn't have to put anything like this. She just talks to the thing and it does what she wants. It calls her grandchildren, it opens her emails, it gets her recipes for things she wants to do by talking to it. She has no trouble using this advanced technology. Now, she recently learned how to use, like, open up spreadsheets and stuff like that, but that was difficult for her. Using this technology was dead easy for her. In fact, it's so easy that a lot of times we don't even know we're using it. It's just so easy to use. Now, what I would submit is the implications for inequality for this technology will be very different than they were the last time. So let me show you some inequality over the ages. This comes from Britain, an economic historian, looked at the share of income in the top 5% earners from 1688 to 2009. We don't really actually know where this date is, but it wasn't me who made it up. Somebody else did it. And what you can see, you can probably say that the Industrial Revolution in Britain started around 1720, or some people say a little later. But in any case, the industrialization led to a slight rise in inequality in the first Industrial Revolution, when industrialization was about iron and cotton and wool and steel and things like that. Mechanical power only, really. And that led to some rise in inequality. But once the second Industrial Revolution came along, where you had electricity, internal combustion engines, people started using chemistry to do something useful in industry. Things like that created all these new products, and industry just took off. And as you can see, it was incredibly equalizing. And it was equalizing because it was giving more power to manpower and no more brain power to the brains back then. Between, say, 1870 and the 1970s when computers came along, this was all about helping men and women do more work with their hands. Power tools, things in factories, you actually had to have a human touching the machine because the machines couldn't see, they couldn't think, they couldn't handle unusual situations. From 1970 on or so, when the computerization made better substitutes for people who work with their hands, but better tools for work for their heads, it was deeply inequalizing. And many people who look at the AI and this development assume we're going to get more of the same. And I would argue that they're not thinking about the fundamentals of the technology. They're just extrapolating the past, which is often a good place to start, but in this time, I think it's going to be different. And in particular, I think what we're getting with machine learning trained algorithms is wisdom or judgment of a certain type, pattern recognition, that becomes in a can, automated. For instance, diagnosis of simple disease, or how do you deal with filing a complaint on a parking ticket, or how do you write a story about the stock market. These are things that used to require humans who had 10, 15, 20 years experience, now can be automated through machine learning and be done by somebody who's average. So I think this AI will eventually create a whole class of semi-professional people between doctors and nurses. Nurses with AI will be way more useful than they were before. And maybe in some countries, it'll be even a lower level of medical assistant using AI, doing simple things and learning when they have to kick it up to doctors. The same thing is true between lawyers and paralegals. Lawyers with all this experience know what to do. Some parts of that are being replaced by robots or automation or outsourced. Between engineers and road chiefs, how much cement should I use here? How thick should the asphalt be? You don't have to call the engineer. You have an app who's machine trained, using machine learning to tell you exactly how much. Or between architects and draftsmen. Maybe you need architects for the genius, but lots and lots of the drawing just requires experience. And if you have enough experience, you can train these things. So on and on and on, I think average people will get more intelligence, and the most intelligent people will get a little more intelligent. So fundamentally, I think it will revive a middle class. But I'm an optimist, so. And we're talking about the future, so who knows? Okay, second of all, or fourth of all, the big difference is Globotics is advancing at an explosive pace. The past transformations were much slower, and I think that's one of the reasons people are either living in denial or hoping they'll have time to adjust. And in the world of business, where people don't have time to adjust, we're seeing incredible disruptions. For instance, if you look at who are the 10 most valuable companies in the world, and you look back 10 years, there's only one or two who are the same. Like Microsoft and I think Aramco are the only ones that are still in there, maybe BP. All the rest have been changed. So in business, this explosive pace is something they can't wait for. Now, since I kind of want to scare you, I want to raise your anxiety, I want to shock you into thinking differently about the future, I'm going to give an example of how stunning this change is. And I apologize to those of you who saw me talk last night. It's the same one, but I won't tell the same jokes. Is that okay, Mantak? Or I'll try not to. Sometimes I can't help myself. Okay, here it is. So, Apollo 11. Any of you recognize this? Any of you see it on TV or in the newspapers? How many saw this like the day after in the newspapers? Okay, this is my kind of crowd. Now, this was amazing. I was in elementary school, and this was America where I was, and we all had the day off. We watched, TVs had just come into the classrooms, and that was supposed to change everything. I can't remember, if you don't remember, it didn't change anything. But it did let us watch the moon landing. So we all watched the moon landing. It was like, that's crazy. Somebody walking on the moon, are you insane? And what that was made possible is one of the largest mainframes in the world at the time, most powerful computers at the time, did the calculations to guide this thing to the moon, land, and come back safely. That was an amazing feat of transformation. But by today's standards, it was nothing. I'll tell you, I'll continue with this for a second, but one of my anecdotes that's in the book, which I read when I was doing the research, which I didn't talk about last night, is it turns out that there was a backup computer on the module just in case. And the average toaster today has more transistors than that computer did. I'm not kidding you. Now, just to continue with this, this is another powerful computer, the iPhone 6s, which came out in 2015. And it has much more processing speed than the mainframe computer that drove or guided Apollo 11 to the moon and back in 1969. Do you know how much more? Stop me when I get there. 10% more? 10 times more? A million times? Okay, you guys are going good. Do I have 10 million? 100 million? The answer is 120 million, exactly. 120 million times faster. Can you believe that? The iPhone S could have guided 120 million Apollo 11s at the same time to the moon. Mind you, things probably could have got a little crowded up there on the moon. But in principle, in processing speed, they could have done it. That's just astounding when you think about it. But what's even more astounding is that this is the iPhone X. It came out in 2017. And do you know how many times faster the iPhone X is in terms of processing speed than the iPhone 6s? 2.5 times, depending upon how you measure the things. It has dual processors, it's complicated, but more than twice. And the only thing they used it for is a camera, but the camera really is much better. But in any case, it's 2.5 times faster. Now, if you do your math, that means that there was more increase in processing speed between 2015 and 2017 than there was in the previous 50 years. 1969, 2015, the increase in speed was 120 million times the mainframe. In 2 years, it was larger than that, the increment. And you know what's going to happen this fall? When Apple releases the next phone, that's probably going to be called the iPhone XS. Do you know how much faster that's going to be? About double. Which means between 2017 and this year, there's been twice as much progress as in the years between 1969 and 2015. So when I say this is explosive progress, this is something that's almost impossible to get your mind around because it involves increments that are difficult to say. There's a bunch of other ones about doubling, which I talk about in the book and many other people talk about. But what I want to talk about now is how we humans deal with this kind of speed. And I'm going to argue the fifth big difference is it's coming faster than most believe. And I want to use the word believe very carefully. Scientists, people who study these things, know that the iPhone XS will be twice as powerful in processing speed. We know that. And in fact, if you go back 50 years to the 60s, we know it's been going on. So it is not unexpected. But we don't believe it. Because we have a brain bug, an evolutionary brain bug. Brains evolved to track motion. The real scientists say this. In fact, if you think about it, everything that moves have a brain, and everything that doesn't move doesn't have a brain. And there's even an animal called a sea squirt that has a brain when it's young and mobile, and as soon as it fixes itself to the rock, it eats its own brain because it doesn't need it anymore. My publisher told me to leave that bit out of the book, but it's one of my favorite ones. Anyways, but the point is our brain, like every other brain, evolved to track motion, but that was in a walking distance world. That's what we had to do. We had to track motion when fast meant somebody throwing a rock or throwing a spear. That's what our brain evolutionarily evolved. And I'm going to argue that that put us with an inherent bias that makes it difficult to think about this kind of growth. So this is how I want to explain it. I want to give a little graph here, progress on the vertical axis, years on the horizontal axis, and I want to argue that humans instinctively think about progress as a straight line. And that's not a scientific proposition, but I want you to believe it. And in particular, I want you to believe it not when you're using your calculator to see what double is, but when you're using your gut instinct to think that things will be automated, or the service sector globally will open up so that people in India are routinely sitting in offices virtually in London, working in London teams. When you think about, is that likely to happen, you're not using your calculating skills. You're using your gut. And the way you use your gut is you think about what's happened the last few years, and you naturally say, well, that's what's going to happen in the next few years. Maybe a little faster, maybe a little slower. But if you assume equal increments, you're straight lining the future. Same increment in the past, same increment in the future, that's straight line. That's what this is. And I'm going to assert that many people, even many intelligent, informed people who should know better, are linearizing the future. But that's not how digital technology works. Digital technology looks like this. It's an exponential curve to start with. So it starts really, really slow. The processing speed is doubling every time, but since the processing speed is so small, the increment seems tiny. And we tend to judge the increments. But once the increments get big, like the iPhone 6S, the increments become explosive. That's this part. Sometimes they call it the elbow of the exponential curve. Now notice, all along here is a constant growth rate, but the increments become explosive. And if you're thinking about the future in increments rather than growth rates, you're going to make this mistake. So this thing jets up, and eventually everything has its limit, so the processing speed will eventually slow down, but not for the next few years. Now what I'd like to call this, or like to point out, is that this leads to a bias. Our gut overestimates the impact of technology to begin with. It's when people sound alarmist when they're talking about technology. People will say, like, every driver in America will be unemployed, and it's X million people and X more million people associated, and it's going to happen in a few years. Because they're straight lining the future, and they sound alarmist, because us, who are looking at the past, see, well, that didn't change much, didn't change much, didn't change much. They're just exaggerating. But by the same token, our gut underestimates the impact of technology eventually. Because we think it's going to go linear, but it's actually going exponential. And this is what I like to call the holy cow moment. That's supposed to be a laugh line. Anyways, a holy cow moment. Actually, driving here, I saw a lot of holy cows holding up. I was early on when I wrote the book, I was a little worried how this would be accepted in India, but I was told that that's okay. It's not sacrilegious or something. But in any case, in business they call it digital disruption. It's when I do this in front of business audiences, I have quotes from CEOs, or actually former CEOs, who knew, for example, digital marketing was coming. But they were still investing in brick and mortar stores, and now they're ex-CEOs and their companies are bankrupt and no longer listed on the stock market. So they were saying, oh yeah, I know all about this digital stuff, marketing for sure, but I have time to adjust. Yes, I'm setting up a website. Yes, I'm training, collecting site. Boom, and they're gone. Amazon's eating their lunch. That's what this holy cow moment is. Now, what I'd like to remind you with this is you can be super smart, super informed, but since you tend to think about the future with your gut, you tend to fall into these mental biases which are baked into the way we view the world. So just remember, you're probably misthinking the future, even if you're a sophisticated thinker. Okay, coming in ways that few expect. This is the other aspect of it. It's coming faster than most people believe, and it's coming in ways that few expect. So the first thing, as Rajat mentioned, think tasks, not occupations. And this is absolutely not me. In fact, going all the way back to 2007, 2006, there was a whole set of economists who looked at task-based jobs. And Alan Blinder, for example, looked at which jobs could be offshored, looking at their tasks. So the notion that you shouldn't view a job as a job or an occupation, but rather as a whole chore of tasks, and that list of tasks can change with technology, that's an old point. In fact, I'm quite sure that many of the people in here used to have secretaries and typists, didn't know how to use a computer. They had somebody else make their telephone calls for them. And now you all do that.